All right. So let's get started, and let's begin our day with GraphQL today. Let me just open up our folder. This is the second to the last day. And here we are solely focusing on GraphQL itself. And we already have a couple of projects like Task Manager API and the original client project. So we would be using the same project for the server, GraphQL server, and this client for our GraphQL client itself. With the whole setup that we have already done, it would be really easy to get the integration done onto the front end and back end. It's just that we need to understand what GraphQL is. So that will be the main focus in here. And this session would serve as an introduction to GraphQL. Um, you may come across this kind of a scenario where your client would refer to a project where you want to use GraphQL in the backend. So this session serves you as a firm, solid background or basic GraphQL, solid base of GraphQL that will be given. And then you can build on this same thing. I'll tell you what else can you look for as far as GraphQL is concerned. All right. So in this particular session, let me just list things down. Also, let me get the server and the client started. All right. And we would be first going for the server. So I'm just keeping the server in here. And we would like to go for, I would like to run the server. So I can go for something called node1. All right. So if I run the server this way, node1 npx node1 server.js is something that we would be starting. All right. And this, what it would mean is it will run the simple node server.js, but then again, if you change anything at all, this would again get restarted. So that's the only thing. All right. So that, plus we would also like to install the client. All right. Let's wait for this to get installed. So Rita has a question. So no need to install nodemon at all, or this command will install it. So see the npx command, Rita, it is something which is taking the nodemon from the global repository, which means you don't need to install it locally on your computer. All right. And you don't, this command would not even install it, it'll just run it, and that's it. So any global things like create react app we went for, we can go for npx nodemon. Npx can be done. So any global repositories, if you want to run, you can just run with the npx command. No need to install it right away. All right. Let's wait for this to get done. Okay. And I'd start the project as well. As of now, I'll just start the React client. I'll not open it in my editor, because first what I want to go for is I want to implement the server side of GraphQL, and then I'd go back to the client side. So let me just, yep, we have already opened up the server, and the server is running, plus it doesn't have any database interaction or anything like that, just some static data that is coming in from the server itself. You might well go for a database connectivity. You might check it out in the previous sessions that I provided for Elegant, for Node.js and MongoDB connectivity. That can be done. All right. So as of now, just some data coming in from the API. Let's just quickly check this out. All right, we have an admin, whatever the username is, and this whole data, it is coming in from the server. All right, from the API server. So that is basically what it is. And we'd also check out our server, which is just one single file. You can organize these things into multiple files as well. So even before starting the whole GraphQL thing, you can see that there is a get, post, put, patch, delete, all kinds of requests that would be going on as far as REST API is concerned. And GraphQL makes it really simple for you in a way where you don't have to go for all the types of HTTP verbs, but you can just go for a post request. Every request in GraphQL is a post request. All right. And you don't have to use basically all the types of requests. It'll become manageable that way. Plus, it is quite possible that we have all the set of tasks that are there, but in the list of tasks that we see here, it's only the task ID and the task title that we need. Plus in the details, we just need the task title and task description. So you see that the data that we are getting in any of this case is the whole data, the whole object of the task. We're not getting just the title and ID in here, and we are not getting just the title and description in here. So we're getting the full set of data, which is something which is not that optimized, right? At times, if the object is very big, loading the whole object on the client, though we'd be mapping it on the client, but that's a different story. Loading everything on the client, it's really difficult, and it'll really be resource intensive. So GraphQL allows you to just request the type of data that you need. Let's say in this request, I just need the ID and the title. I'll just go with the ID and the title request. Here I can just go with the title and the description request. But say for example, in future, you also need the date or the completed status. You don't have to actually modify anything on the server. Your client can request that extra field and the server would still be ready, providing the whole field itself. All right. So that whole aspect is something that GraphQL covers, where the programming would be dynamic, and you'd not be getting extra data, or you'd not be getting less data. You'd be getting exactly what you need as far as the data is concerned. All right. So two things. One is that in GraphQL, every request would be a post request. There's no problem in managing all the types of requests and all. So there's no other request, only post request would be there, even for get operations or anything like that. And the other thing is it'll be dynamic. Like for example, today I need just the ID and title in the listing. I may need completed, that is the status in the listing, somewhere down the line. I can just modify certain things on the client. The server would be ready to give that particular data anyways. You don't have to do any modification on the server at all. All right. So those are the two things where GraphQL actually capitalizes a lot. So I believe everyone, first of all, is clear on why exactly we are using GraphQL. Yes. Like to have a confirmation from all. And you would see in a while that our server would totally be dynamic as far as the data is concerned. Just like to have a confirmation that everyone understands why are we going for GraphQL in this particular case rather than a REST API. So basically GraphQL is a replacement to the REST API. All right. And we would like to go for the server-side implementation first. So let me just list down certain things in here. And I'd also check out, like I'd also list down the website. it's sort of a query language that has been built, and there is a really easy way to query things as well, which we would see. All right. Okay, so let's just copy GraphQL definition. All right, and it's basically like the definition is all given over here, and you can just read it in here. Like GraphQL is a query language, blah blah. GraphQL provides a complete and understandable description of data to your API, gives the client the power to ask for exactly what they need and nothing more, makes it easier to evolve APIs over time. All right, so the APIs would be dynamic. That's the whole point. All right, so and then there are powerful developer tools as well. That is also there. Okay, but usually if you're a server-side programmer, you know that if the client has a new requirement, client in the sense like if the client, which is a mobile phone or a web browser, if that application has some new requirement for the new field, as a server-side programmer, you'd have to go and program that on your server. With GraphQL implementation, you'd not have to do it. All right, so GraphQL, and we would like to go for two places where we'd be implementing GraphQL. Of course, one is the server and one is the client. Client is a React client. All right, so in the server we'd be installing two more dependencies. One is Express GraphQL and one is GraphQL itself. And in the client there's actually a very good tool that is available for both client and server, actually, Apollo GraphQL. All right, and in this particular case, Apollo GraphQL actually helps you to go for both client and the server. However, we would like to just go for the Apollo client, all right, and not the Apollo server, because that will be an overkill actually. And we would like to go for just this particular software, that is Apollo/client, and that is the latest version that would allow you to get GraphQL inserted as well. Like GraphQL is also something that is required on the client side, but this Apollo client has it as a dependency, so we would get GraphQL anyways. And we would be using these two, like probably not use query, but yeah, we can use query actually. Use query and Apollo client from this particular case. All right, let's see how things go. Okay, let's just copy this and paste it in here. And use query would simply be a custom hook that Apollo client provides to query certain things. All right, and we would be able to basically use this as a hook to your client, or maybe we can go for something better as well. Let's see how things go. All right, so instead of use query, I think there is something else as well that is available. Let me just see. Yeah, I'll check it back like once we are onto the client. I'll check the way to query GraphQL. All right, because there is an Apollo client that is available that we can create. Like instead of use query, I think I can go for Apollo client as well. But let's see how things go. All right, let's just wait for it. Okay, so this happens. Use query, yeah, this would only be for the components, right? There is an Apollo client also available, so I'll just list it down, Apollo client, so that I don't forget. All right, and this Apollo client would enable you to create a new client, and use query more or less related to the components only, so we might not go for use query at all, but these are the things that are available. So first we'll be setting up the server with these two libraries, and then we'll be going for the Apollo client, setting up the client as well. So I believe that is something which is clear. Plus, let's set up the agenda for today. So first, we already have the NodeJS server set up, so I'll just implement GraphQL on server. And that means get and get/id, that get task/id. These two requests are some things that we want to maintain. All right, before that, I'll just give a small GraphQL demo. Same project, same server. All right, and then implement the GraphQL on the server, and then we'd like to implement GraphQL on the client with the requests, tasks, and single task, that is task/id. So get single task and tasks is what we are going to go for. All right. So this is what we'd be getting. This is what we'll be getting done. All right. So I believe everyone is clear on the agenda for today. Always required on the both sides. Yes, that's correct. You can manually go for a post request, but that would not be an ideal scenario because GraphQL requires some setup of its own. So always have to be implemented on the server and the client. All right. So I believe everyone is clear on the agenda for today. Very good. What about other participants? Okay. So let's start with the server installation. And we already have our server started. And first, we would like to go for the GraphQL implementation. And first, I would just like to set the GraphQL up, and then I would also like to discuss some more things on GraphQL, like what all facilities are available as far as GraphQL is concerned. So that is something that we'd like to do. First, I'll just set up GraphQL on the server. Go for an npm install express GraphQL, and this library express GraphQL is very specific for express server installation, express server and GraphQL implementation, and GraphQL itself. Let's wait for this to get installed. All right. And we would be implementing from express GraphQL. We'd be going for a function called create, just a sec, GraphQL HDP. Yeah. GraphQL HDP is a function that we would go for from the express GraphQL that will create an endpoint for us. And there's also another thing that we would like to go for, which is called build schema. That'll come in later. But this GraphQL HDP allows you to create an HTTP endpoint that would accept post requests. All right. So let's set that up first. So as soon as I go for the course, I can go for app.use, and I can designate a URL for GraphQL. App.use means it accepts all the requests. Now all the requests would be required because later on I would also like to have a GET request in here for a CLI, for a GUI for GraphQL. So I can just say API, for example, and I can go for a GraphQL HTTP middleware, like so. All right. And this GraphQL HTTP middleware accepts 3 arguments or 3 keys inside an object. So the way we implement is we designate a URL. App.use means all the requests, all right? And we designate a URL called /API for the GraphQL, and use the middleware GraphQL HTTP, which would be anything like a middleware function is. And it accepts an object as an argument, and minimum 3 keys. One is called schema. I'll come back to this. What is schema? And then there is something called root value, and then there is something called graphical, GRAPHIQL, graphical. It is good for the development environment. When it is true, we can just have a good GUI to query the GraphQL databases. But for now, we'll just go for these 3. And then there are others as well, but schema, root value, and graphical are the important ones. All right, and we'll see what each and everything means. As far as the server is concerned, I think if I, for example, run this API now on the browser, because graphical is true, it'll probably provide us a GUI on the browser. Let me just do that. Localhost. Localhost 3001/API. And there you go. Provides us a GUI, but this might give us an error, so that is a different thing. All right. So no query, nothing at all. So this is the GUI that it provides us. All right. So this is the initial setup to start with. To get the GraphQL thing running, where you import a GraphQL HTTP, you designate a route that is /API is where GraphQL would be working, and you go for GraphQL HTTP in here. It takes in an object, 3 keys, schema, root value, and graphical. They are defined. They should be the same. We'll see what is schema. We'll see what is root value, and graphical true means it gives you a GUI to work with. All right, on the server itself. So first of all, this setup should be clear to all. Yes. Uh, okay. Someone mentioned that Shubham mentioned voice is breaking down. I believe the voice is fine now. Okay. I just connected to my backup network. So again, once more, GraphQL has to be imported from Express GraphQL library. It's a middleware, like this routing middleware that we had yesterday. And we go for an app.use/API, which means we are creating one API route. And that has this GraphQL function implemented, which takes in an object which has 3 values, schema, root value, and graphical to be true. When we have graphical true on localhost 3001/API, we get a GUI available, but then there is no schema, there's no root value. That causes certain problems for us, so we'll solve that. But first, the initial setup, I believe, is clear to all, right? Okay. I'd like to know from other participants as well that this is clear. So graphical true, if I go for graphical false, and if I go for localhost 3000/API, for example, this would not give me any GraphQL interface. So a graphical means a GUI interface to be given. So obviously in development environment, you would have graphical to be true, but then when you go for production, they should be false. So maybe they should be coming in from a config file or something like that. All right. And what about other participants? I'd just like to have a confirmation with the initial setup of GraphQL here. Some participants already have reverted that they're good to go. What about others? Okay. So now let's see what is schema and what is root value. So whenever we go for any GraphQL interface, the way the GraphQL would be accessed by the client is always decided by the schema. Basically, it is like a structure for your queries, all right, whatever the queries that you go. And the root values would have something called resolver functions, which would basically be the actual functions that would do the query. So schema is the structure of your query, and the root value would be resolvers that would be the actual functions that get the programming done. So you can say that schema would be just some definition of a types and all, while root value would be a set of functions that would basically run according to the definition that we provide in the schema. All right, so I would give you first a small demo of what a root value and a schema can be, but before that I'd just like to type in some specific terminologies about GraphQL. There is something called queries, there is something called mutation, and there is subscription as well. All right, so when we talk about query is equal to the handling of get requests, all the get requests, while mutation means you want to mutate the data, which means the equivalent of post, put, delete, and patch. type of request. Subscription is a different thing. It's sort of a pub sub kind of a mechanism where the server can actually send some data to the client, so real-time applications can be built. So we're not going to subscriptions as such, but there are queries and mutations, and mainly we're just focusing the queries first this time around. Like query is just equivalent to the get request, while mutation is post, put, and delete and patch. So this query and mutation and all that would come into the picture. So say for example, if I want my client to query for a message to the server and I want my server to deliver that message, this is what I'll be doing. In the schema, I'd be building a schema for the query, and in the root value, I would actually go for a resolver function that would actually execute the query, return some data to us. So say for example, first of all, I can go for a const build schema from GraphQL. All right. And here I can go for build schema, and I'll just go for, backticks because it allows me to have multiple lines of code. And in the schema that we build, there are always types that we can mention. One of the type is query itself. All right. And the query I want right now is a message query that would give me a string. All right. So what I want is a message query that will give me a string. String is one of the data types in GraphQL, and message query would be something that would be firing in from the client. So what we are basically doing here is we are building a structure for our GraphQL client that, okay, the client is allowed to query something called message, and the client would get string in return. So we are just first building this simple type of query, which in the root value, I can actually go for message as a function that would return me, let's say, some string, hello world, or something like that. All right. So this is the relationship between a schema and root value. Root value consists of resolver functions that actually do the work, while schema consists of structures. So that also means that this over here, this key should be same as this key in here. So the structure and the root value remains the same. So what we are telling here is that your client is capable of firing this query. In return, you'll get a string, and the string would be hello world to start with. All right. So this is the schema, and this is the resolver that we have. So if I go for graphical true, right, and if I reload this whole thing, you'd get a graphical user interface, and I can go for query, and my query would be message. All right. And if I just run this, you can see that I get the data hello world. All right. I can actually return certain things in the message, like an object or something like that, which you can then go for, giving a data type. So say, for example, I want a message, but then the message could have two things, like status or color, and, the message text itself, like color and text, like we did with the alert in the front end. So in that case, the message should have its own data type. All right. But before that, this schema and the root value, a very basic query that we have mentioned inside the structure, that is the schema, and the corresponding resolver function with the same keys gives you the same data type in return. I believe this schema and root value combination, that is clear to all. Yes, everyone? All right. And the default mechanism for GraphQL is querying itself. So you don't have to specifically go for specifying this query over here. You can just simply go for brackets and message, and that would simply give you that data message equal to hello world. All right. And we are following the schema inside the root value. But at times it would also be possible that you might want to have an object returned rather than just a string. So say, for example, I want something like, text to be this, and let's say color to be danger or something like this. All right. So if this is there, and let's just put it inside brackets like this, so it returns as an object. But this object, it doesn't actually adhere to the definition that we provided in the schema. So probably if I go for message, you can see that string cannot represent the value, color, and the text and all. So the schema has to be something that the resolver is, or maybe the resolver has to be something that the schema is specified with. schema just mentions that, okay, message would return us a string, but the message function itself is returning us an object with two properties, color and text. So in that case, we can actually create custom data types as well in GraphQL, like something like this. For example, let's say type, you can say alert, and in the type alert, what I want is color to be string and text to be string as well. And inside this, I can mention alert. So now you can see that I have created a custom data type which would have two keys, color and text. And I'm returning on the query, I'm returning an alert. So this time around, the query should be happy. There should be no problem as far as getting the data is concerned. So if I now run this, selection subfield. Yep. So now run this, it doesn't give you that type error, but you can see there is another error. Message of type alert must have selection of subfields. Like we have certain fields provided in here in alert, out of which, what field do you want? So say for example, I just want text. When I do that, you see that it gives you the text hello world. But then again, if I also want color, I can specify color as well. And this would give me text and color. And that's what I mean by the server being dynamic. Whatever you specify, you'd have to just set up the structure right away with all the possibilities, and you would get the data only about only the data that you need. Maybe if you just need color, you'll just need, you'll just go for color. And if you just need title, you can just go for title. If you need both, you can go for both. So this message query has to have some subfield selection out of these specified subfields, that is color and text. So that is basically what we are looking for as far as tasks and get task is concerned. All right. So I believe this querying that I did, plus this type that I set for alert and the query that I set, I believe this is all clear to all. Okay, Rita has a question, like can we make a model of alert and can we bind it? So Rita, this is not JavaScript, and we can do that in the root value resolver. You can make a model of alert and bind it over here, but this also has to be specified. So this would in any ways not be dynamic. All right. So this has to be statically, or maybe your alert class that you create as a model might have a function that will return something like this. That can be done, but the schema has to be specified. The mapping and all can be done inside the resolver function where the actual JavaScript resides. All right. So this type alert, the custom type that I created, and we already had the type of query, and we specified this as a return value, which we are returning over here, adhering to the schema. I believe these things that I did as the first setup of GraphQL and an introduction, this one is clear to all. Yes. Is it possible to directly enter values into the type alert? You mean default values is what you're talking about, Ketan? I don't think when you go for the type, there will be default value available. You can specify that, okay, this is compulsory, like this kind of a thing can be specified. Exclamation means things are compulsory, but default values, I don't think types can have default values. Still, let me check. GraphQL types default values. You can have default values for the arguments that is there, but I don't think the argument can have default value, but not the type itself. Yep. You can just say that it is compulsory, but not anything else. All right. So no default value is possible while defining the data types. You can go for it inside the model that you create, though. That is the task model or anything like that. All right, Ketan. Okay. So now I'll just comment this out so that it stays as a reference, and I would go for a new setup, because what we want is we want a task schema available, and then two queries that we want. One query would be to get all the tasks, and one query would be to get single tasks. All right. So first we'll get all the tasks and then get single task. But in any which way, we need a task schema also created. So a type task also created in here. So that is something that we'll be doing. So let me first create a schema in a separate variable, and that'll be build schema, and I'll go for the backtick signs, and I would have the type task. All right. So I need one type task, and the type task has an ID. It has a title. Let me just check out the model. It has ID, title, description, completed, and date. So date is the JavaScript date data type. Completed is a Boolean. So there's no JavaScript date data type available in GraphQL. So we'll keep it as string. Description is a string. Title is title. ID is a number, but you can also keep it as a field called ID, I capital, D capital. That is also there as far as GraphQL data types are concerned. And let me also list the, get you the GraphQL data type API. I think it is here somewhere. So these are certain scalar types, and then there are some enumeration types. Here you can just read more about it. So I'll just keep it listed somewhere. All right. And what we need is ID to be a number. So I'll just say ID is ID. ID, it's actually a data type in GraphQL. And then title would be string, description would be string, completed would be Boolean, and date we'll just have it as string, because there's no date data type in GraphQL. So what we are trying to do here is we're trying to be ready for all the possibilities that are there, but at the same time we're not returning all the data. We're just mentioning that, okay, these are the things that can be requested because there's some structure that is necessary anyways. And we'd have query. All right. And this query for now, we'll just go for tasks as our query. And this task query, what do you think this task query would return? Anyone, any ideas? If you just want to set the type, what would it be returning? And I don't want the exact syntax, but logically speaking, what should this tasks query return? What data type? What value? Yeah, but what data type of response, Shweta? I don't think there should be Boolean. If you go for a GET request on the tasks URL, what do you get in response? Anyone else? Any ideas? An array, very good question. An array, very good, Jinesh. So it'll be an array, and then it would be an array of what? Array of what data type? Array of task. We already have this task type available. So we can go for something like this. This is how you denote that this tasks return us an array of tasks. All right. So this is basically what it is. And now we'd like to get the resolver done as well. That is the root value. So I would go for a const root value is equal to, we can have tasks as our query, like so. By the way, if you don't want to do this, you can also do something like this. This would also be the same. It is just that key value pair combination, the same key having the same value. This also can be done. All right. And in here, what I would do is I would return tasks. This tasks already have that same data type. So this is my schema, and this is the root value. Root value is having a method called tasks, and it returns tasks altogether. So this is the same as having this kind of a method done. All right. So we'll just keep it this way. This is better looking syntax. All right. So this is our root value, and then we'd go for app.use/API GraphQL HTTP. This would have schema, root value, and graphical true. So, so basically we are just using the object shorthand. Schema is equal to schema, root value is equal to root value, and graphical is true. All right. This can come from a config file as well. Now, let's see what happens. Of course, there's no method or there's no message kind of a query available. So even if I just do a control space, it'll give me what all types of queries are available. Right now, tasks is available, and in which I can go for control space. Let's say I just want the title. All right. And if I hit enter, you can see that I get all the tasks just with the title. If I want the ID, I can go for ID, and it'll be ID and title. So you can see that with just one setup, you can make things quite dynamic. Description, ID, title, description. Just want the date in here, ID, title, description, and date. Date is basically a timestamp. You can convert it to some local string or something like that. But this kind of a thing is now possible with the queries that we have. All right. And the setup was simply like this. We defined a type, and we covered all the aspects, like what is the possibility that can be returned. And we are just specifying a type, another type called query. There'll be a query called tasks that'll be returning us an array of tasks. All right. And we are returning the array of tasks in here, the root value itself, which is basically this that we created yesterday. All right. And we are just setting up our GraphQL with the schema, root value, and graphical. So this is just one resolver function as of now inside the root value altogether. All right. No need for comma to separate the fields. So again, Rita, this is GraphQL syntax and not JavaScript. So no need for a comma in here. It goes without a comma. And this is GraphQL syntax of giving the types. All right. So this and the query that I fired in, as I said, you don't need to explicitly specify query in here. It'll still be a query the default way. Then it could be mutation and so on and so forth. But the query that I fired in, the way it gives you the dynamic data, if you don't want description and just want completed, that is totally fine. Any order is fine. Like if I go for ID, order actually doesn't matter at any place, but you can have any order that you want in here. So it is that sort of a dynamic thing that GraphQL provides us. So I believe this initial setup with the tasks related thing, I believe this is clear to all. All right, very good. What about other participants? Just like to know from everyone that this is clear. Okay. Others as well, please revert. And if you're still not clear, please let me know. Okay. Very good. If we need to define more than one schema, is that possible? More than one schema might not be, but inside the schema, you can define any data types that you want, and there will be a query where you can define any queries, any number of queries or mutations or anything that you want. So in this schema, there will be more possibilities that you can go for. Like more than one data types might be possible, but not more than one schemas. All right. So this being done, we would now like to check this out on the front end by going for the list of tasks to go with. There's one more query that is yet to be done, which is getting one single task. So basically this type of a query where task is task. All right. So the task query gives you one single task. That is something that we need to do. All right. And there will be an ID passed, and we'll be seeing that what or how the ID gets to be returned and checked and all. So that is something that we do. But first, we'd go for the front end, and we would implement this query on the list of tasks that we have that is over here. All right. So let's open up the front end. And we would be going for GraphQL implementation. Like we can go for it in any one of these levels. Now, what would you suggest that which layer do we target so that we can get the GraphQL implementation done on the client? Let me just make sure that I have some different theme available in here, because both the themes look same. Yeah, this would be fine, I guess. Or yeah. So basically this is your server, the colored one, and the dimmed one is the client. Doesn't actually look right. Yeah, this green one is the client. Okay. All right. So what layer or what specific folder do you think that it should be starting to code GraphQL in? Anyone, any ideas? Service. Very good, Rita. I believe everyone would agree that services, because services are the ones that would call the API. So I can go ahead and get certain things done inside the services itself. So let's see what we can do in here. All right. So first of all, I need to install the Apollo client that we mentioned. That is Apollo client over here, which would basically be acting as the GraphQL client. So let's install that. And let's wait for this to get installed. Now you can see that it also requires something called GraphQL on the client side as well, which we would install in a while. Let's just wait for a while. Okay. And we would go for Yarnet GraphQL as well. That was mentioned as an unmet pair dependency, so I'll just put that GraphQL in. So Apollo client, of course, and GraphQL on the client as well. That will allow you to fire in queries. Okay. And what we can do is, generally what happens is I go for a folder called GraphQL in here, or GraphQL client or something like that, in which I create a client.js file. And here I create the Apollo client, I import it in any service that I want, and then I can fire the queries. Basically that would be what would be happening. So I would import from Apollo client, and there are actually a couple of things that we need to import. First of all, Apollo client itself, and then there is a HTTP link, and then there is an in-memory cache. So the thing is that GraphQL stores some certain part of the response inside the memory of the browser as well. So it caches some response, and HTTP link is just for the link to the server. That's the base URL of the server essentially. So there are certain things that we need to import here: Apollo client, HTTP link, and in-memory cache. Now, you saw in the documentation of GraphQL, Apollo client itself, that there was a use query kind of a hook available, which you can use in the components, but that is for components only. You'll not be able to use any hook anywhere else. So this is more or less a standard way of going for Apollo client. So first, we just set up Apollo client that will act as our GraphQL client with HTTP link and in-memory cache. Let's see how we do it. I go for const client is equal to new Apollo client, and this would have certain options where the link would be a new HTTP link, and we can have the URL inside the HTTP link inside the HTTP link to be the exact URL that we want. So which is, let me just copy it from somewhere, which is this URL, the API endpoint that we want to use, right? So this will be our URI. Plus we'll also have I think cache is equal to new in-memory cache, something like this. All right, and I do an export default client. So basically I'm just creating an Apollo client, and I'm exporting that client with some basic settings. And as I said, you can use query hook, and you can go for querying anywhere else. But as I said, this would be a better way of going for it. All right. So this is the client creation, and I'd be importing it in any service that I want, and I'd be querying the server with this particular client that I have. All right. So this whole creation of the client, I believe this is clear to all. Yes. Very good. What about other participants? All right. Now I go to the service. I import the client in here. Now remember, as I do have this whole task URL, oh, by the way, this URL actually can come from the config, because we do have the config, right? The API. Can we give an export const Apollo or GraphQL, oops, URL could be base URL plus API. This would be actually better. We can go for the GraphQL URL and put it inside the client. That'll be better. That import so there's only one place where you have to change the URL, and that will be the post request that will be going on. So in API, or you may imagine that then there will be like users and all, but that is for a REST API approach. But if we just go for the GraphQL approach, there'll be just a base URL and the GraphQL URL, and that'll be it. All right, nothing more than that. All right, but if you are following a REST API approach, there'll be too many URLs to manage. That is also a problem. So anyways, we'll not have the task URL required at all. We'll just keep it though, because there is some delete and all that is working based on that. So here, what I can do is I can import client from GraphQL/client. All right, and I can actually name it GQL client, because that is exported by default. You can name it anything in here, and I'll comment out the axios.get. It's only the get tasks that we are targeting right now. So what I can do is GQL client dot query. All right, and the query has one option called query, where you can fire in the actual GraphQL query. Now, when you want to fire the GraphQL query, you'd have to use one delimiter, which is or separator kind of a thing, which is called GQL from. Either you can go for GQL from GraphQL, or you can also go for from Apollo client. Both would be fine. All right, and here I can go for something like this: GQL backtick signs, and here I'd be firing in my query. So my query is, remember, this is the tasks related query, and I want tasks, and out of the tasks specifically I want the fields. Now can anyone tell me what are the fields that I want in here? inside the tasks, what are the fields that we want? ID title. Very good, Rita. ID title. All right. So this is my query that I'm firing in, which is tasks and ID title. Now this GraphQL client, again, it's a promise-based mechanism. So let me just go for the promise first, and let me just check the response of what it gives us to start with. All right. Something different from what Axios would give us. But if I check out my client, right now, definitely no tasks to show because we are not returning anything in here. If I do an inspect element, I should get something inside my console. And that would be, let's see. Yep, we get this where response.data is available, where data is basically an array of 5 elements and all. So we can simply go for a response.data returned. All right. And we can return this promise itself, like we used to do the axios.get return. Okay, so now, and you can definitely store this query somewhere where you want to. That can be done. But now, once we go for this kind of a query, and if we check out our tasks, let's see what we get. Oh, I think there is some problem yet. Because response.data.tasks has to be there. So if I do a console.log response.data, all right, there will be a tasks key available inside the response.data. So let's do that first. So if I reload, might have to get rid of the return for a while. Yeah. So you can see that the response.data, it's actually an object with the key tasks. So here, instead of response.data returned, we should return response.data.tasks, and then this should be returned. Right, so there's some change as far as this return is concerned and the Axios return. So once we do this, you can see that now this whole set of tasks come in from the GraphQL itself. All right, and this is the first combination of the client and the server. Now what did we do on the client? We went for an Apollo client and an HTTP link in memory cache. We imported the GraphQL URL from a config file, and then we created an Apollo client with the link and the cache settings that are done, and then we exported the client. So wherever you now want to use the client, can just do a client.query, and you can pass in the query, whatever the query is, whatever the mutation or the subscription is, you can pass it in, and things would get going. What we did as a query was tasks ID title, which we got inside the response.data inside the tasks property. So this query would be this property basically. So that is the combination. And there is nothing else that we need to change because everything is set, as far as components are concerned, and even Redux-Saga is concerned. So we are following the rules as of now of Redux-Saga as well. So I believe this first step where we went for getting all the tasks, I believe this is clear to all. Yes? All right. Rita asks a question, what is the use of cache? So caching is something that GraphQL does on the browser's memory, essentially, which means that the data would be quicker. So if, say for example, I'm repeatedly querying the server, all right, and if the data doesn't change at all, then it's not necessary for us to bring the data back. That's the whole point of it. So if there is a change, would you get the data from the server? Otherwise, you'd get it from the cache of the client. So a bit quicker than normal. Right? And I would like to just know from you all that this query that I've done for get tasks, this is clear to all. Yes? Very good. What about other participants? Okay, so now let's go back to the server for that get single task implementation. Now that we know the basic setup, things would be easier for us. Let's go to the server. And we do have a schema that is already built. We have a query type also, in which we just would add one query that will be task, and that'll give me the task. So, I can simply do something like this, like task returns task into the bracket 0, all right, and here a comma. So this is also like the key value pair combination. If the key and the value are the same, you just go for either one of them. So basically what I did was I added a query in here, which returns as a task, and I added a similar query in here, which gets you that whole single task in return. But we would not want this task specifically every time. All right, we would like to base it on some ID that we are going to pass. But once we do this modification, let's test this out, so that that is in the GraphQL GUI, that do we get this running or not. All right, so let me just go to the GraphQL graphical user interface, and let me just go for task. All right, query task. Maybe I need to reload. All right, task is not defined. Ooh, actually the error is in here. Should be tasks into the bracket 0. And if we run this, you can see now every time you'd get the first task only, but instead of tasks, if I go for just the task, I'd get any field that I want. Just if I just want the title, just get the title. All right, so this query that we specified and this dummy data that we specified in here, this works. Now what we have to do is we have to pass an ID inside this function, search through the tasks with that ID, and return the task altogether. All right, so I believe first of all, this query is clear, and what are we going to do next is also clear to all. Okay. What about other participants? Just like to have a confirmation from all. All right. So now we would like to get the ID passed, and in that case, we take in an argument here, like so, and the argument that I want is ID, and the ID that I want is a number, or you can also mention ID. That is still an argument, a valid argument data type, and this has to be compulsory. All right, so task has to have an ID that is compulsory. So if I do not have an ID while querying, this would give me an error, like ID of the type ID is required and not provided. So I can provide that for now, maybe 1. Oh, actually should go something like this, ID 1, for example. And if I run it, now you get the task, though it is not giving you as per the ID, whatever the ID would be writing down, it will return you the data. So that is still something which is yet to be done. But this is how you can signify that, okay, there is an argument that is expected in here, which is of the data type ID, or you can also go for number. That will also be fine. And you can take that argument in here. Now let me just show you what argument we'll be getting. All right, I'll just take in args for now. I'll just go a console log args. All right, because this is an object that we are getting. So if I just run this, all right, and if I check out my Node.js console, right away you get ID with the data type 4, or sorry, with the value 4. Whatever the ID that I pass in here, let's say 6, for example, hit enter, you can see ID 6 is available on the console. So basically we are getting an object which gives you the ID. So what we can do is we can right away do a destructuring in here itself, like ID can be done, and we can mainly just define task is equal to null to start with, and return that task in here. All right. And in the middle, we can just, for now, we can loop it through, but then again, it should be like a database call or something like that. And we can use the same thing that we did in here. All right. Where we are running a loop. If something matches, we return that, else we return null, that kind of a thing. All right. And now if I, for example, do this, you'd get task equal to null because there's no ID called 6. But then if I go for ID is 2, then you would see that you get the task. And again, the fields are all dynamic. So title, description can be obtained if you want to. ID or completed, that also can be obtained per task, whichever the task is. All right. So you can see that how easy it is now to get things done as far as querying is concerned. You don't have to worry about, multiple, what do we say, multiple routes at all. Only one route, that is API, is fine. And you can just keep on adding things to the schema and the root value so that things would be working. All right. So I believe this function that we have done, I believe this is clear to all. Yes, everyone. Like to have a confirmation from all the participants, please. Okay. All right. So this being done, we go back to the client to get the task ID added. So let's do that. And here there's a get single task. I'll comment the Axios thing out. And we'd go for return GraphQL or GQL client dot query. And we'll have a query passed in, which would be a GraphQL query. So GQL. And the query that I want is task. And it is a get single task method. So in that, as of now, we just need title and description. Right. So this is the querying format that we have for GraphQL, title and description. Plus, we need to pass in an ID as well. So it'll be something like ID, which would be interpolation of the ID that we have in here. All right. So that is basically, this is the parameter and this is its value. We're interpolating the value. All right. And I think this should be okay. We can return response. And in this case, we know that we have a response.data, but then we'd also have the individual key inside the response. Like we had tasks for the tasks query, we'd have task for the task query as well. All right. So once this is done, all right, things should work really fine. I mean, there should be no change at all as far as the front end is concerned. So if I do this, or maybe if I reload first, you see that things are going okay. If I check out my networks API requests that are going on, and let me just reload stuff. First of all, there is this localhost API that is coming in, and that is more of a GraphQL thing, but more or less somewhere here down the line we'd get an API available with the post request. One was the pre-flight request, then you get the post request data, and then if I go on and click here, there'll be another post request. All right, this is again a post request that goes on onto the server. So this now has changed. You get the title and description, and we also get the type name field. That is a GraphQL default field that is added. So you can see now what happens is that, say for example, on the client, you just want to, in the task manager, or sorry, the task detail component, you just want to add a field called completed. All right, what you want is task.completed or something like that. All right, so inside the paragraph, let's say you want to replace the status of the task. So let's say status, maybe you can go for something like strong status. All right, and we can go for, let's say, a span tag where we can have a task.completed. If it is there, I'll say complete, else not complete, or maybe pending. All right. So right now we don't have any completed field, but we don't even have to go to the server. We can just easily add one more field in here that is completed, and that'll be it. So now if I go on to the front end, you can see that the status pending would be displayed, like most of the statuses are pending. If I, for example, have some tasks in here which have completed true, for example, this one. All right. And if I go to express, you can see that the status would be complete. Others would be pending. So you can see I actually didn't have to change anything on the server, and I got things done just by changing things in the client. That's the reason why GraphQL is really popular. Plus, it just takes off the whole responsibility of handling multiple kinds of requests on the server. At the same time, it makes the server dynamic. So a very good replacement and a very effective replacement to the REST API protocol that people used to follow. Nowadays, GraphQL would be something that people would be following. In future, it'll be more and more GraphQL that'll be used with most of the front ends. All right. So I believe the effectiveness of the GraphQL, the setup on the client and the setup on the server, that whole aspect of GraphQL is clear. And I think everyone is well introduced now to this whole GraphQL setup. Yes. All right. Very good. I would just like to have a confirmation from all the participants, please. If you're still not clear, let me know that. And if you're clear, please tell the same in the chat. Okay. Yes, we can write more than one query for different types on the server. That is absolutely there. And Shweta, if you recall, in the server, we are creating this new task, right? And I'm passing in this argument as true. So in the model, it takes this argument, default value false, but it takes this argument anyways and assigns it to that particular completed flag. All right, Shweta? So that's where we set the data type. And you can have like same query, a different query on the same resource, totally possible. All right, Rita? Okay. So this is what I wanted to go for in today's session, where we had a good introduction on what GraphQL is, and then you can build on top of it. Now that you know the setup of the client and the server, things become really easy. You have to study what mutations are, but more or less it is just functions that you'd be creating, while you'd have a type mutation added, and you'd have mutations added that way. Mutations would add, edit, delete, and do any mutation to the data, while queries would be doing the get requests on the data. Though the HTTP verbs that we'll be using, it's only post and nothing else. All right. So yeah, so this is it for today, guys. And what we wanted was to get these things done, which we did. And if you have any questions, you can ask. You can ask those questions, and else we can go forward. So for post also, you can use GraphQL, Rita, but you'd have to go for something called mutations, which we have not covered in this particular session. It was not intended to be covered. So you can go for post request with GraphQL, but for that, there'll be no queries. There'll be something called mutations in GraphQL. So you'd have to create a mutation on the server, all right? And then the mutation would be simply provided in this particular root value. All right, Rita? Try that out as well. Let me know if that works for you. Whatever the question is, you can simply get that asked in the next session, that is on Monday. Okay. Yes, sure, Shweta. So I believe that is clear, Rita. Instead of query, you should go for mutations. See how that works for you, and let me know on the next session. So Shweta asks, can you explain higher order components? So Shweta, if you recall, we created a component for routing that actually managed the security of the routes. So say for example, without logging in, if I go for tasks, I'm reverted back to logging in. So that is an example of a higher order component. So if I just define higher order component, all right, it is a component that returns us another component with some functionality added. So higher order component is reusing the component logic. They're not the part of React.js API. There's no facility in React, like there's no API called HOCs, but they're a pattern. So it's sort of like a enhanced component provided by a simple component. An example could be over here. Let's say a comment list. It's returning a set of comments. So this is the comment list, and this is the blog post, and this is a text block that it's returning the whole blog post itself. So the comment list and the blog post combination is specified in here somewhere. Yeah, actually it is a very long discussion in this case, but let me just explain it to you in a very simple terms. Say for example, in the client we had this this whole route that we created. All right, a simple component that is route. But then what we wanted to do was we want to enhance this capability of the route component uh, in the fact that if the user is logged in, let the user through, else just stop the user from using that particular component. So what we did was we created another component, user route, and in which we returned the route component or the redirect component. Basically, we enhanced the capability of the route component itself by the user route in here. All right, so it is this user route component which is called a higher order component in this case. And again, there's no syntax as such in React for higher order component. It's just components within components, but the new components that emerge, they're enhanced versions of the previous components. So this user route that we created is a very good example as far as higher order components is concerned. All right, Shweta? Is possible to upload an image in GraphQL? Yes, it is. However, the image upload would happen on the server through Node.js, but you can have the type of the image as a string and all. So the image, like the data of the image can be uploaded, and then you can maybe store that image in some database or maybe on a physical location, and then store the URL inside the database. That can be done. So again, GraphQL is just a structured way of doing it. It's like SQL. It's a query language, and it doesn't have any limitation of that sort because it doesn't have to deal with the data. It just have to provide a structure, and the dealing with the data happens on the server. So essentially, if you are able to upload images on your server, you are able to upload images in GraphQL as well. So GraphQL is more or less a structure. All right. Okay. So please let me know, guys, if you have any other questions, and if not, say 0 so that I can conclude the session. All right, what about other participants? Okay, so now we'll be calling it a day, guys, and we'll see you for the last session on Monday. That be going for 2 topics. One is unit testing, and if possible, we'll also go for some introduction on server-side rendering by using a framework called Next.js. All right, so let's go for that on Monday. And this is it for today. Bye-bye. Take care. Have a great weekend.